Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 3.13, the 1st of May. We ended last week's episode with the death of Adolf Hitler, the storming of the Reichstag by the Red Army, and the first discussions amongst the new German leadership as to how exactly they should approach the Soviets and offer their surrender. The end of the war was in sight, and peace was tantalizingly close in Berlin. But unfortunately for the people of Berlin, there would be a few more twists and turns until peace finally reigned across the city. After midnight on the 1st of May, the fighting, which had been raging non-stop for the past week in the city, suddenly died down. And the reason? Well, because today was May Day, and given the fact that the Soviets were on the cusp of victory, as soon as the clock struck midnight, frontline soldiers let their hair down to celebrate the holiday. Officially, the war was still as hot as ever, and the senior Soviet commanders had no intention of slacking off. So they continued pushing their men to seize the remaining German positions and complete the conquest of the city by the end of May Day. But in these early hours of the 1st of May at least, the fighting did ease off just a little. And whilst the Soviets took a short breather to celebrate the arrival of May Day, the battered and mangled Berlin garrison troops also relished the chance to get some rest. Shortly after midnight, in the lull of the fighting, General Krebs and Colonel von Duffing, who was General Weidling's chief of staff, left the headquarters of the Citadel defense sector, and they travelled to the Soviet lines. And joining them was SS Lieutenant Nylens of the 15th SS Latvian Fusilier Battalion, who acted as the group's Russian interpreter. Radio contact had been established with the Soviets, who promised safe passage to Krebs' group. And when the group arrived at a Red Army command post, they were taken by jeep to General Chukov's headquarters near Tempelhof, where they arrived shortly before 4 a.m. General Chukov greeted Krebs' group in person, and Krebs informed Chukov as to what had happened. "What I am about to say," Krebs began, "is absolutely secret. You are the first foreigner to know that on the 30th of April, Adolf Hitler committed suicide." Chukov, who was probably a fantastic poker player, replied, saying, "We know that," which was a bare-faced lie designed to throw Krebs off. This opening spiky exchange set the tone for the rest of the meeting. In theory, the discussion should have been short but sweet, as the Germans clearly had no cards to play. Their leader was dead, they controlled only a slither of the city, and the Berlin garrison was on its knees. But the German leadership didn't seem to have understood just how grave their situation was. Because Krebs had come to negotiate, even though he had nothing to negotiate with. All he could do was read Hitler's political testament, and then follow up with a statement from Goebbels calling for a satisfactory way out for the two European powers that had suffered the greatest losses in the war. This message from Goebbels was somewhat sincere, as Goebbels had been pushing Hitler since late 1943 to conclude a separate peace agreement with the Soviet Union, as he calculated that the alliance between the Allied powers was fragile and could perhaps be split. But to try and coax the Soviet Union out of the war on the 1st of May 1945 was a tough sell, to say the least. Unsurprisingly, Goebbels' message failed to impress General Chukov. For the Soviets had one simple demand: unconditional surrender to all of the Allied powers, now. A meeting which should have taken 5 minutes dragged on for hours, with Krebs trying in vain to get the Soviets to recognize the authority of the new German government headed by Grand Admiral Dönitz. The Soviets couldn't care less, and Zhukov kept insisting that the only thing they were interested in was an immediate unconditional surrender, only for Krebs to diplomatically skirt this by replying that he lacked the authority to negotiate a surrender. And on they went. Whilst these initial negotiations were being conducted, a temporary ceasefire was put into place. But sensing that Krebs was deliberately trying to stall the negotiations, the Soviet negotiators informed Krebs that if Goebbels and Bormann did not agree to an immediate unconditional surrender by 10:15 that morning, then the Red Army would blast Berlin into ruins. Sensing that neither side was going to get what they wanted, Krebs agreed to stay at Zhukov's HQ whilst the German delegation's documents were communicated to Moscow by phone. In the meantime, it was agreed to establish direct communications between the Soviets and Goebbels in the Führerbunker. So Colonel von Duffing was sent back to German lines with a Red Army signals major in tow to lay down the necessary cabling. Of course, this being the middle of the Battle of Berlin, when von Duffing and the Soviet major approached German lines, they were fired upon by nervous German troops, severely wounding the Soviet officer in the process. Von Duffing was arrested by the SS, but when he insisted that he was there under orders from SS Brigadeführer Munke, he was released. Von Duffing then reported to Goebbels and Bormann in the bunker, and he updated them on the progress of the negotiations. Goebbels balked at the idea of unconditional surrender to all Allied powers, so he ordered von Duffing to return to Zhukov's headquarters and retrieve Krebs. As a reminder of just how hopeless the German position was, and how the only sensible conclusion to this madness was an unconditional surrender, the Soviets followed through on their promise made earlier to Krebs, that if the Germans had still not surrendered by 10:15, then the fighting would continue. 10:15 came and passed, and not messing around, Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front forces unleashed a tremendous wave of fire onto what was left of the German-held city centre. At 11 a.m., von Duffing arrived back at the Russian lines, where he contacted Krebs by telephone. Krebs told him that he couldn't leave General Zhukov's headquarters just yet, as they were waiting for a call from Moscow in response to the German negotiation papers. Soon afterwards, the expected call from Moscow came through, and with the Soviets happy that the Germans had their papers in order, Krebs was allowed to travel back to meet von Duffing. And together, Krebs and von Duffing went back to the German lines. When they arrived, Krebs dismissed von Duffing, saying that the German reply to the Russian demand of an unconditional surrender would be sent in writing. The remaining Berlin garrison troops holding out in the centre had experienced a brief respite from the Soviet shelling whilst the first peace negotiations were being conducted. But with the failure of those negotiations, things had quickly returned to normal, and everyone had felt the shock and awe of the renewed Soviet artillery bombardment. And now that the fighting was back on, there was enough time for another horrific episode to take place. On the 1st of May, fearing an imminent Soviet assault through the U-Bahn tunnels leading to the Reich Chancellery, SS Brigadeführer Munke ordered SS Brigadeführer Krukenberg to dispatch a group of sappers from his Nordland Panzergrenadier Division to go through the tunnels leading to Potsdamer Platz. It's unclear what their precise orders were, and it's possible that they simply went into the tunnels to secure them from any possible infiltration by Soviet infantry. In any case, The next morning, on the 2nd of May, an almighty explosion tore apart the section of the north-south tunnel, which ran under the Landwehr Canal near Trebinestrasse, close to the Gleisdreieck U-Bahnhof. Reports as to the exact timing of the explosion are sketchy, which is unsurprising given the fact that Berlin was a literal war zone and no one had slept for days. Plus, in the dark and dank tunnels of Berlin, no one could tell night from day, anyway. Historians might have difficulty pinpointing the specific timing of the explosion, but they are unified in describing what happened next. Water from the canal came rushing in, and once it penetrated into the connecting shafts, it eventually led to flooding along a 25-kilometer stretch of S-Bahn and U-Bahn tunnels under the city. Given that the tunnels were one of the safest places for Berliners and garrison troops to be, it's no surprise that they were filled to the rafters with thousands of people. Chaos broke out, and in the panic, some wounded, drunk, and delirious people were reported to have slipped under the rising torrent, never to be seen again. Whilst the event was surely traumatic, widely differing casualty figures from the flooding were given in subsequent years, with some estimates being as low as 50, whilst others claimed a death toll of thousands. These higher estimates, however, are viewed skeptically by historians, who argue that the floodwater, whilst terrifying to shell-shocked Berliners, was unlikely to have risen quickly. Plus, given the dissipation of the water into adjacent tunnels, it's also implausible that the water rose to dangerous levels. In any case, what is undeniable is that the flooding certainly added to the misery of the people huddling in the tunnels for safety, and the chaos the flooding caused certainly led to some unnecessary deaths. After the failure of the initial negotiations between General Krebs and General Zhukov, the fighting had well and truly sprung back into life all over Berlin. To the west of the city centre, General Zhukov's 8th Guards Army, led by the 29th Guards Rifle Corps, had crossed Budapester Strasse on the southern edge of the Tiergarten Park, and they had also taken the nearby Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche, also known as the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. Once they captured the church, artillery observers had a commanding view over the area, and they could direct artillery fire onto the Germans with ease. And snipers were also installed into the high church tower to terrorize any German troops who dared cross the streets. The adjutant from the Panzer Division Müncheberg, who we've featured before in our series, recorded his experience of fighting around the Zoo Flak Tower on the 1st of May. Our anti-aircraft guns on the Zoo bunker fire without stopping. The division has now only got 5 tanks and 4 guns left. One group is fighting in front of the Zoo bunker, where thousands of people are at the point of asphyxia. The memorial church has been taken by the Russians. Late afternoon, there are rumors that Hitler is dead, and that surrender talks are in progress. Civilians ask us if we're going to break out. Russian pressure along Budapester Strasse cannot be contained much longer. We will have to withdraw again. Wounded are screaming in the cellars. There is nothing left to ease their pain. Here and there, despite the fire, women come up out of the half-demolished cellar entrances with their hands over their ears, unable to bear the screaming any longer. The Zoo Flak Tower, which had been engaged by General Zhukov's forces the previous day, and which had been sent a demand of surrender, replied to the Soviets on the 1st of May, saying that they would indeed surrender at midnight. And the reason for the delay? Well, because some of the remaining garrison troops inside the Flak Tower planned to stage a breakout, and thus they needed more time to prepare. However, the chances of their breakout succeeding were slim, as more elements from the 2nd Guards Tank Army and the 8th Guards Army were advancing towards the flak tower from the north. This meant the Zoo flak tower was encircled, cut off from the rest of the Berlin garrison in the center of the city. Meanwhile, other elements from the 2nd Guards Tank Army captured the Tiergarten S-Bahnhof, before advancing further towards Savignyplatz, where they linked up with the 3rd Guards Tank Army from Konyev's 1st Ukrainian front the next day. To the south of the city centre, elements of the 79th Guards Rifle Division had captured the S-Bahn station at Potsdamer Platz, and were currently trying to dislodge the final German troops from the U-Bahn station. Moreover, other Soviet troops had advanced beyond Potsdamer Platz towards the direction of the Siegersäule. Elsewhere, Soviet troops also captured the junction between Leipziger Straße and Wilhelmstraße, whilst the SS and Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrecht Straße, today known as Niederkirchner Straße, were also in Russian hands. All of these advances into the centre show that the area under German control continued to be squeezed on the 1st of May, and that unless negotiations were successfully concluded in the next 24 hours, there wouldn't be anything left for the Berlin garrison to surrender. As darkness fell on the evening of the 1st of May, the fighting once again eased off as the jubilant Soviets went back to their May Day festivities. In the Reichstag, despite the demands from Stalin that the building be fully captured by the 1st of May, savage fighting was still ongoing. Gradually, the upper floors were cleared out, but a sizable group of German troops still clung on in the cellar of the building. This ragged bunch of fanatics, who lacked any water to sustain themselves, choked on the fumes of the fires still raging in the building. By the afternoon, however, this group was running low on ammunition, and recognizing the senselessness of continuing the fight, they shouted to the Russian troops that they wished to surrender. Suddenly, 300 dirty, unshaven, and haggard German soldiers and officers appeared from the basement, hands in the air and weapons on the ground. Officially, the Reichstag wasn't declared completely pacified until the 2nd of May, but to all intents and purposes, with the surrender of the soldiers in the basement on the 1st of May, all organized German resistance in the building was finally broken. In the attempted defense of the building, the Germans had lost hundreds of troops, whilst many more still lay wounded in a makeshift dressing station in the cellar. Whilst the Berlin garrison troops were being shelled and civilians were drowning in the tunnels, Goebbels and Bormann were busy engrossed in their favourite pastime, politicking. After years of infighting amongst Hitler's inner circle, Goebbels and Bormann were now the last two standing. But unfortunately for them, they could only flaunt their power for a few hours at best. Dönitz, who had been designated Hitler's successor, wasn't formally notified of Hitler's suicide until late in the afternoon of the 1st of May. But he took his new duties seriously, and at 9:30 that evening, Dönitz, as the new president of the Third Reich, issued an announcement over Radio Hamburg that Hitler had fallen in the Battle of Berlin. The specific circumstances of Hitler's death, i.e. that he had killed himself, were deliberately left out of the announcement. The remaining German troops in Berlin, who had been cut off from the world for days, didn't formally hear of Hitler's death until many hours later, though rumours about Hitler's demise had been spreading all day throughout the streets and tunnels of the city. With the failure of the initial peace negotiations due to the Soviet insistence on an unconditional surrender, Goebbels decided that he was not going to go down in history as being the man who capitulated to the Russians. Therefore, it was time for him to also leave the stage. In the early evening, after drugging his children with a deadly concoction of cyanide capsules covered in chocolate, Goebbels and his wife Magda ascended the steps into the Reich Chancellery garden, and they committed suicide. Their bodies, just like Hitler and Eva's, were doused in petrol and set alight in a ditch. No one mourned Goebbels' passing, and actually, with him gone, everyone was now free to make their own exit. General Krebs and General Burgdorf opted for suicide, whilst most of the bunker's inhabitants, including Bormann, opted to try their luck by attempting to break out of Berlin. For the rest of the Berlin garrison, and for the people of Berlin, Goebbels' suicide represented something else, a chance for the bloodshed to finally end, as there were no more madmen left standing in the way of peace. General Weidling called another meeting of his remaining district commanders at his headquarters on Bendlerstrasse. In the meeting, he argued that by committing suicide, Hitler had violated the oath he had taken to the German people. Thus, in return, the army were no longer bound by their personal oath to the Führer. Weidling saw no alternative than to surrender to the Soviets, and with Goebbels also now dead, this process could hopefully proceed more smoothly. Some of Weidling's senior commanders at the meeting, however, indicated their willingness to instead break out of Berlin rather than surrender to the Russians, and thus plans quickly formed for multiple breakout groups to escape from the capital. Yes, the Berlin garrison forces in the center of the city were largely surrounded, but scouts had reported that the Soviet forces in Spandau were spread out quite thinly. Therefore, this route out to the northwest of Berlin represented the best opportunity for a successful breakout. There was also some lingering hope that by breaking out to the west of the city, they could perhaps make their way to General Wenck's 12th Army, retreating towards the River Elbe, though this seems to have been wishful thinking at best. Weidling, however, chose to stay in Berlin and take responsibility for the surrender negotiations. But to give the breakout groups the best chance of success, Weidling pledged to hold off the negotiations until midnight. As honorable as Weidling's offer was, by now the Soviet control was so strong and the Berlin garrison forces so weak that breaking out successfully from Berlin was an almost impossible task. Nevertheless, throughout the night of the 1st of May, leading into the 2nd of May, multiple groups attempted to break out from the center of Berlin, and undoubtedly there were also many other undocumented groups or even individual soldiers who also tried to slip through the Soviet lines. Of the breakout attempts we do know about, however, the breakout led by SS Brigadeführer Mohnke is the best known. Mohnke's breakout was to leave from the Reich Chancellery at 9 p.m. on the 1st of May, and this group consisted of bunker personnel such as Hitler's private secretaries, along with Wehrmacht remnants and depleted SS units. Meanwhile, part of the breakout force also consisted of a group of high-ranking Nazis led by Martin Bormann, which also included Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann and SS Colonel Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, who was Hitler's last physician. The objective of the Reich Chancellery breakout groups was to head towards the north of the city, using the S-Bahn and U-Bahn tunnels to reach Stettiner S-Bahnhof, now known as Nordbahnhof, and from there they hoped to march to the Gesundbrunnen train station. And if the breakout groups made it that far, they were to then split up and make their own way out of the city. to escape through the tunnels was smart, as the Soviets still preferred not to use the tunnels where possible, for fear of being ambushed by German troops. But not much else of the plan can be praised. Apart from the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower, the entire northern half of the city was in enemy hands, and the idea of survivors reaching German forces outside of the city was delusional. SS Brigadeführer Krukenberg agreed to join Mohnke's breakout force, and he left to round up his foreign SS volunteer units, still holding the line against the Soviets. This task of rounding up what remained of the foreign SS units was easier said than done, however. For instance, Krukenberg dispatched an aide to collect his French SS contingent, but in the chaos of the fighting, the aide was never seen again, and the Frenchmen, led by Henry Finet, never got the chance to break out of Berlin, and they were instead captured by the Soviets. Eventually, the delays Krukenberg suffered in locating his men meant Mohnke's breakout group was forced to leave without Krukenberg and his men. Mohnke and Bormann hurriedly assembled everyone in the Führerbunker and split them up into smaller groups. But given the delays in finding everyone and briefing them on the escape plan, the breakout force wasn't ready to leave until 11 p.m. The first group to leave the bunker was led by Mohnke, and his small group was to act as the vanguard of the breakout, with the rest of the other groups setting off at 10-minute intervals behind him. Mohnke's group passed through the cellars of the Reich Chancellery before sprinting across the Wilhelmplatz to reach the temporary safety of the U-Bahnhof Kaiserhof, today known as U-Bahnhof Mohrenstrasse. Once here, they entered the U-Bahn tunnel, and as soon as they reached the next station at Stadtmitte, they switched to another U-Bahn tunnel, leading northwards to the Friedrichstrasse Bahnhof. As they moved through the tunnels, they were joined by an ever-growing number of civilians, who, frightened of what would happen to them when the Russians finally captured the city, decided to tag along with Mohnke's group. When the group reached Friedrichstrasse, they intended to use further tunnels to pass under Russian lines and reach the north of Berlin. But they suddenly came across two railway watchmen who refused to open a watertight bulkhead, which would have allowed the breakout group to pass through. Bizarrely, the watchmen had been ordered to lock the bulkhead between the last train at night and the first train in the morning, and they were determined to follow this order to the letter, despite the fact that no trains had passed through these tunnels for at least a week. Rules are rules, guys. There's nothing we can do about it. Forced to find another escape route, Mohnke's group went back up to street level, but upon seeing that the Weidendamme bridge over the River Spree was being heavily shelled by the Russians, and that it was blocked by an anti-tank barrier, Mohnke's group wisely decided to avoid crossing the bridge. They instead opted to pass over the Spree by using the metal footbridge which ran under the railway line leading out of Friedrichstrasse, roughly 300 meters further south. Finding that this footbridge was only blocked by some thin lines of barbed wire, they cut through and headed in the direction of the Charité Hospital. The following breakout groups, however, did opt for crossing over the Weidendamme bridge, and the groups realized that for their crossing to have any chance of succeeding, it would need to be launched with complete surprise. However, so many disparate groups of escapees were now converging at Friedrichstrasse that what had originally been separate small groups of people trying to slip through Russian lines undetected had now swelled to a massive group of Wehrmacht soldiers, SS men, and civilians, totaling hundreds, if not thousands of people. This growing body of troops and civilians would not go undetected for long. As the 1st of May drew to a close, General Weidling, who had waited as long as he could before entering into a new round of surrender negotiations with the Russians, decided that the time had come for him to perform his duty. Shortly before 11 p.m., the following radio message was broadcast in Russian to the 79th Guards Rifle Division. Hello, hello. This is the 56th German Panzer Corps. We ask you to cease fire. At 0050 hours Berlin time, we are sending envoys to parley at the Potsdamer Bridge. The recognition signal is a white square with a red light. We await your reply. The Russians confirmed that they received this message. It wasn't clear to the Soviets whether the request to talk was another delaying tactic, or whether it was proof that the Germans were finally ready to surrender once and for all. In any case, General Zhukov, whose forces controlled the Potsdamer Bridge, ordered his troops to implement a ceasefire in the area, in anticipation of the arrival of the German peace envoys. Thank you for listening to the Europe at War podcast. If you're enjoying the show and want to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button. You can also help spread the word by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really makes a difference and helps more people discover the show. And if you like what I do, why not consider becoming a Patreon supporter? In doing so, you will help keep the podcast marching forward. To find out all the details, please check out patreon.com/Europe at War. Thank you.